How would you define history? What is the process of historical thinking? Those are the main elements of the guiding question for Unit 1 in our course. As you've probably noted, or at least hopefully noted, on the intro page to the learning module, in this course we will be completing a bunch of exercises that will help us to get the ball rolling with our class. Some of that is kind of housekeeping types of things. The email assignment, for example, is essentially a syllabus quiz. Um, Also, the introductions on the discussion board may get tedious or old because you do them for every online class you take, but they're important. It's essential for us to get to know each other and to begin to communicate with one another so that we can share our ideas about historical knowledge and the construction of historical narratives. So something that I've just alluded to then, and the materials in this unit have made kind of clear, is that history is much more than just memorizing a series of dates and names. Many of you may be breathing a sigh of relief when you hear that. Um, Dates and names are a very small part of history at best. They really have nothing to do, I think, with what history is actually all about. Instead, history is about understanding multiple perspectives on past events, understanding that our ability to read the historical record is limited by that record itself. The kinds of sources that we have access to are always incomplete. The kinds of perspectives that we have are always incomplete. Power relations determine whether or not people's records will have survived to the present, whether or not someone's papers get into an archive, for example, whether or not someone is remembered, have a lot to do with their relative position of power within their society. So that's just one element of some of the problems that historians face as they try to write about the past. So what we're going to think about then and focus on here in this unit is something that will help us as we continue throughout the course, and that is the process of historical thinking. We'll talk more about what that actually looks like, what historical thinking is, as we also work to define history. But I really just want to emphasize that historical thinking includes all of the habits of mind and the types of critical thinking that historians have to use in order to make sense of the past, in order to answer the questions that they have about the past. This is not included in the materials on history and historical thinking in this unit, but Jim Grossman, who is the executive director of the American Historical Association, has once pointed out that it's often more difficult to ask a good historical question than to find the answers. So as we think about the notion of historical thinking, what that process is, I want you to think about what he meant by that. Why might it be more difficult to ask a good question than to find the answers? And why is it that many of our questions lead us to other questions? That's part and parcel of studying the past. As you've noted, each of our units is organized around a guiding question. So I've emphasized the guiding question for this first unit, which is about how do we define history and historical thinking. How does historical thinking help us to understand what the academic discipline of history is? We're going to look at that major question as we talk about those things that I keep mentioning, history and historical thinking, but also as we think about how we define Latin America. Is it a region? Is it a process? Is it a place? What areas are included? Which ones aren't? Why? We're going to read a couple of different historians' accounts about how this idea of Latin America took shape, what some of the forces were around it, and why it still holds currency today. So we may sometimes be talking about different things when we mention the term Latin America. So we'll talk about what some of those differences are, what some of the various ways it's defined are, so that we can come to not necessarily a consensus, but just an understanding of the various perspectives that exist on this region that we'll be studying this summer, or this semester, I should say. Um, so that's kind of the basic lay of the land for Unit 1. Please don't hesitate to ask questions whenever you have them, especially as you're getting started with things like Twitter. Tiki doesn't have an assignment for this first unit, so you don't have to do a timeline, you don't have to do a journal, but you will have to do all of those things in Units 2 through 5. So please do look at the timeline assignment so that you understand how to get on the course timeline and how to post to it. If you do that before we get to Unit 2, you won't, you'll be able to hit the ground running. You won't have any problems with that. So, and you can ask questions of me long before we have to actually do those things. So I'll leave it here for Unit 1. I'm looking forward to meeting you all, getting to know you better, and learning from your perspectives on history itself.